This lecture covers socio-emotional development in early childhood. To begin with, we'll look at this picture that's on the left. We have a picture of two humans. One has long red hair, pigtails, a dress, a pink dress. She has a slingshot in her hand. Notice the slingshot is covered blue. Notice that I referred to her as a she after I started describing her hair and her dress and the color of her dress. She's also wearing some long white socks and some red slippers. She's surrounded by a bunch of toys that are in blue. There's a race car track, an airplane, a football, a baseball, a wrestling action figure, a dump truck toy, a robot, another action figure, and some sort of remote control device. On the right, we see another human being in blue, short blue hair, wearing blue coveralls, what look to be some sneakers, or maybe not sneakers, just maybe some shoes. This individual is holding a pink doll along and surrounded by other pink toys, including a dollhouse, a carriage for a baby, what looks to be like a Barbie doll, a toy horse, might even be a unicorn. I believe it's a mirror, a tea set, and then also an ironing board. Now, I think we can all agree that all of these toys that we see here, both blue and red, exist for the most part. Some of them might be a little bit outdated, but they are all parts of American culture, and we as adults purchase these toys for children to play with. I think all of that is true. And I think it's probably true to say that we purchase specific toys for children based on their sex, whether or not they're male or female. Furthermore, we buy these children clothes to wear that aligns with the sex that they were born as. And so what I want you to understand is that what we're going to start discussing is gender, because the clothes that we wear is not sex. The colors of clothes that we choose to wear is not part of our sex. This is part of our gender. And so a big topic in today's lecture is going to be gender. Before we get to gender, we will discuss general emotional and personality development. We'll be discussing the development of the self that occurs in early childhood. We'll be discussing the psychosocial crisis known as initiative versus guilt, which is part of Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory on personality development. We will discuss general emotional development as well as moral development, and then we will enter the discussion of gender development. And all of this is part of emotional and personality development in early childhood. We will then discuss the role of families and how they influence the development in early childhood. We will discuss the various parenting styles that exist, as well as general birth order and how that might influence our development. And then lastly, we will discuss the role of television and video games in early childhood. To begin with, we will discuss self-understanding. Self-understanding is the awareness of ourselves, our physical characteristics, the activities that we engage in, and our emotions. Now, this might seem very basic to you, but understand that we are discussing development in early childhood. Do babies at the age of 10 months understand their physical characteristics? Does a baby understand that they have blonde hair? Does a 10-month-old human understand that they like to play outside? Do they understand that they are feeling happy, sad, or jealous? Maybe. It's very difficult to prove with absolute certainty. Does a 10-month-old human being view themselves as a boy or a girl? Do they have that self-understanding? This kind of self-understanding develops throughout early childhood. It may begin younger than age 2, but certainly it is between the ages of 2 and 5 and 6 that this development occurs rapidly. It is also complemented by the understanding of others. Because, for example, with regard to sex, understanding the difference between boys and girls, to know that someone is a boy, for someone to know that they are a boy, that is also for them to know that they are not a girl. And vice versa. For a little girl to understand that she is a girl, what does that mean in terms of her perception of what makes a boy? And so being able to understand differences in each other, not just biologically, but also socio-emotionally, that assists in our self-understanding. That assists in the development of the self, of understanding and knowing who we are. Children in early childhood initiate behavior constantly, especially compared to infants. In infants, for example, they lack motor skills, they lack verbal skills. But now, during early childhood, that we have advanced gross motor skills, and we can run and jump and walk and skip, and we also have linguistic ability, so we can talk and we can yell and we can say words that we choose to say. All of that is part of initiating behavior. And I'm sure you understand by now that as parents, as part of our responsibility, it's part of a parent's responsibility to monitor behavior, to be observant of child behavior, and reward appropriate behavior and punish quote unquote bad behavior. Reinforcement and punishment occurs all the time and never all at the same time. What I'm saying is that we do not always get rewarded for our good behaviors, and we do not always get punished for our bad behaviors, but we often do get rewarded for good behaviors and often do get rewarded, or excuse me, punished for bad behaviors. But sometimes we can be rewarded for quote unquote bad behavior. If a child is saying a curse word at the age of 3 or 4, and although we might view it as a bad behavior, but we start to laugh when the child says that behavior, that laughter, that attention might be very stimulating to the child, and that might serve as a type of reward or reinforcement that is likely going to increase that behavior and make it more likely to occur in the future. Because again, does a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old understand what a bad word means, or do they just understand it as a word that they've heard before that they are imitating? So aside from that example, it is important to note that, it's important for humans and caregivers, and parents to reinforce good behaviors, because reinforcement is going to promote that initiative and that creativity. It's going to promote children to be creative and share with other people what they're thinking and what they're feeling. Every day, I'm sure it's safe to assume that children at the age between the ages of 2 and 6 are being told to be quiet. They're being told to shut up by their parents. There are parents that are asking them to leave them alone because they're tired and they don't want to deal with interacting with a child because they've had a long day for whatever reason. What this does is it punishes that type of initiative that a child is engaging in. They're taking the initiative to engage in social interaction. They're taking the initiative to want to talk to a parent, to want to hang out with a parent, for a lack of a term, to associate with a parent. But if we punish them for those types of good behaviors, because I think we can all agree pro-social behaviors like initiating communication, that's a positive that we want to see children doing. We want to see our children being able to approach other people and communicate with them. But if we are punishing them for doing that when they do it to us, well, in theory, that's going to essentially suppress that behavior. It's likely going to foster feelings of guilt for that behavior. But conversely, it's important to note that we can punish bad behavior, and that can essentially help with the development of our sense of morality, understanding the difference between good and bad and right and wrong. So excessive punishment, on the other hand, which I'm sure everyone is going to have a different opinion as what constitutes excessive, this can lead to low self-esteem, lack of motivation, and lack of creativity. That's what the research demonstrates. If a child is constantly being punished for trying to engage and trying to interact and trying to share what they're thinking and they're feeling, oftentimes that is associated with low self-esteem, lack of motivation to engage in that kind of social interaction, and also a lack of creativity, because what these children are being taught when they're told to shut up and be quiet and to stop being annoying, they're essentially being told that their thoughts and their feelings essentially don't matter, and in fact they aren't worth anything. And so basically that can lead to feelings of worthlessness. And so we do see that children at the ages of 4 and 5 are beginning to develop feelings of low self-esteem because they don't feel like their creativity and their thoughts and their opinions and their feelings matter. So with regard to emotional awareness, with regard to emotional development, we'll be discussing emotional awareness and emotional regulation. So emotional awareness is the ability to understand the emotions of other people. It's part of theory of mind, being able to understand what other people are feeling. And this is associated with pro-social behavior. So it's at this point where I want to explain the difference between pro-social behavior and antisocial behavior, because oftentimes antisocial behavior is misunderstood when we discuss it in terms of social sciences. Pro-social behavior is sharing and caring. It's helping. It's good manners. It's yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, all of that kind of good stuff. Being able to see that someone else is feeling lonely or someone else is feeling sad, and being able to identify that and then trying to offer some sort of assistance. Being able to see that someone needs help with moving something and then offering them the help, that is pro-social behavior. Antisocial behavior is more associated with like aggression, bullying, name calling, those kinds of things. We often associate antisocial behavior in layman terms in popular culture. It's used to describe people that are maybe shy or quiet or introverted. When we use the term antisocial behavior in social sciences, what we are actually referring to are people who are engaging in behavior that is disrespectful of other people's rights. It's essentially not being respectful of other people's right to privacy, other people's right to basically being left alone if that's what they want. So bullying, name calling, pushing and shoving, tripping people, and we see children engage in that kind of behavior. That is basically antisocial behavior. It's maladaptive, and it comes from a lack of emotional awareness. It comes from a lack of, experiences where people have tried to explain to them, try to think about how other people feel and treat other people the way you want to be treated. Emotional regulation is the ability to understand and manage our own emotions. And so we as humans, we are emotional creatures, more so in childhood. In childhood, we're very emotional, and we're going to continue to be emotional throughout adolescence and some of us into early adulthood. But the sooner that we gain the understanding of what it is that we're experiencing in terms of emotions, because again, do you expect a 3-year-old to have a full understanding of their emotions? Probably not. They're so young and they have such little experience in socializing with other people, and they still are developing theory of mind, and they still lack emotional awareness. Being able to get them to try to communicate how they're feeling and how they're thinking will give them a better understanding of their own emotions and give them a better understanding of why it is that they're feeling the way that they are. This is known as emotion coaching, basically asking a child to explain to them why they are feeling the way that they are feeling. Being emotionally dismissive is basically telling a child to stop crying, or asking them, basically telling them, I'll give you something to cry about. Telling that to a child who's crying, I'll give you something to cry about, or telling them to just stop crying right now, I need you to stop it right now. All of that is basically saying that your emotions are essentially not worthy of my attention, and I don't care to see you express your emotions. And when we get older, and as we become involved in more complex relationships that are more intimate, part of the success of those relationships is going to be dependent on our ability to communicate our emotions with our partners and be able to understand how our partners are thinking and feeling. And so it's going to involve emotional awareness and emotional regulation. But it's important to understand that these are skills that begin developing at a very early age in life. And so what we see is we have adults who struggle with this. They struggle with regulating their emotions. They struggle with communicating their emotions. They struggle with understanding the emotions of other people. And so we essentially see delayed emotional development in these adults. So part of our socio-emotional development in early childhood involves the development of our morality. Morality is our understanding of right and wrong. What is right and what is wrong? Where do we get an understanding of right and wrong? And how complicated does this become? Well, does a 10-month-old know right from wrong? Does 11-month-olds understand right behavior or wrong behavior? Does a 2-year-old? Maybe. As you can see, as we enter early childhood, we begin a stage of morality known as heteronymous morality. Heteronymous morality is very black and white. It's very straightforward. There's not a whole lot of flexibility. There's not a lot of whole thought into why rules and laws exist. Most of the morality that we see developing in early childhood is based on respect for authority figures, which means that we follow rules that are explained to us by our parents and by our teachers and by police officers. We basically understand that there are rules in society and we just follow the rules. Do not question the rules. They're just like, they don't even have that cognitive ability really to question. Now as they get older, they'll start asking why, right? Well, why is that? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to do that? And but when they're early on, kids often just do what they're told to do because most of their sense of morality is based on respect for authority figures, as well as fear of consequences like punishment. Young children, they will often, they will choose their behaviors, or their behaviors will be strongly influenced by their sense of right and wrong. What constitutes a bad behavior? A bad behavior is something you get punished for. So, for example, why is speeding bad? Is speeding bad because you get a parking ticket, you get a speeding ticket for it, and that's why it's bad? Well, for children, that's the way they think. They believe that the reason why a behavior is bad is because of the consequence associated with it. The reason why speeding is bad is because you can cause a car accident and hurt yourself or other people. And so fear of the punishment of the behavior is typically what is used in early childhood to gain an understanding as to what is right and what is wrong. If a behavior is praised, that means it's good behavior. If a behavior is punished, that means it's bad behavior, which can be true at times, but as we get older, we understand that, behavior is complicated, morality is complicated. So, for example, let me give you an example of what constitutes immoral or bad behavior based on the eyes of punishment, when it's based on punishment. So not that long ago in the United States of America, it was illegal for people of opposite races, for a person who was black and a person who was white, to get married. That was illegal. People who did that would get punished for that behavior. And so therefore, that behavior of interracial relationships and interracial marriage was viewed as immoral. Well, it might have basically been the other way around, that it was viewed as immoral, and then, we basically implemented laws that basically proved that it was immoral. Not proved, but essentially established that philosophy that it was immoral. But again, if you're raised in a society where that's the law, you just understand the law says that these people cannot be doing these things, well, your understanding is that it's immoral when you have this kind of heteronomous, straightforward thinking. Furthermore, young children believe that breaking rules always leads to punishment. This is known as imminent justice. It takes a little bit of experience in life to understand that sometimes we can break rules and we don't get punished for it. We get away with it, or we begin to understand that sometimes rules are not implemented as consistently as we think that they are. But at first, once we start to learn an association between a behavior and a punishment, we basically operate under the understanding that you always get punished for that behavior. It takes experience of not getting punished for it that we begin to realize that imminent justice is not always true. Sometimes people get away with breaking the law. Sometimes people do bad things and don't get punished for it, and that's part of life. Now, autonomous morality, this begins to develop after early childhood, entering middle childhood, which we're going to be getting to next week. This is a type of morality, a type of moral understanding that basically understands that rules and laws can be changed. And so rules and laws are also different for people. So, for example, it's during early childhood that a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old may not understand why they have to live by a different set of rules than their 10-year-old brother or their 10-year-old sister. The 10-year-old brother or sister, they have a different bedtime. They have different rules that they have to abide by. And they have the ability to understand that a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old has a different set of rules than they do, because they understand that there are different rules for different people. And so morality is complicated. It's not just black and white. Not everyone has the same rules. Not everyone always gets punished for breaking the rules. Furthermore, we begin to understand that with immoral behavior, we must consider intention. We must consider whether or not there was a direct intention to break a law, or to break a rule. So think about that. Should people who break a law or break a rule that they didn't know existed, or they did it by accident, should they be punished for that behavior? And so just presenting that question and just being able to be open as to whether or not they should be punished for that behavior if it was not intentional or they didn't understand the law or the rule, that is basically demonstrating a higher level of morality. Children, younger children, they're always ready to throw down the hammer. They believe that yes, you broke a rule, you should get punished. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Just get punished. You just get punished for it. That's what happens. The image at the bottom here demonstrates basically Freud's, this is a symbolic representation of Freud's id, ego, and superego. So the devil on the shoulder represents the id. This is basically rooted in our biology and our biological impulses. And so anytime we're seeking pleasure, whether it be eating or drinking or talking or doing whatever it is that essentially that we want, whenever it is that we're trying to do whatever it is that we want to do for whatever reason, oftentimes that is driven by our biology, it's driven by our impulses. But some of those things can be immoral or they can be bad behavior. So for example, when a child in early childhood, in a classroom, just gets up and walks around and starts walking around and starts grabbing other people's things, that behavior is completely impulsive. That behavior is completely driven by the id, essentially. The id is all about basically doing what the person just wants to do without thinking about the consequences or thinking about the rules in place. Rules and consequences, that is driven by the superego, which is the angel on the right, or represented by the angel on the right. Where does the superego come from? Well, we learn rules and laws and we develop a superego from religion. You know, we read the Bible, we read other sorts of religious texts that basically tell us how we should behave and how we should act. And of course, typically these texts also include a punishment, basically like hell. They say like if you don't behave, you're going to go to hell. If you break these rules, you'll go to hell. But they also talk about reward. You know, if you engage in this good behavior, you'll be a good person and you'll go to heaven. And so the angel is all about basically establishing a sense of morality, a sense of right and wrong. Our parents teach us these things. And so some people have a very strong id and some people have a very strong superego. And for some people, it's more balanced. We are the ego. You, the individual, that is the person who is essentially trying to manage or balance the wants and needs, or I should say the wants and needs of the id and then the commands of the superego. So we've now reached the section on gender development. We started this lecture with talking about gender identity, or gender development, I should say, because it's such a big part of early childhood socio-emotional development. Let's talk about all of the different elements of gender. So gender identity, this develops throughout early childhood. Gender identity is basically how we view ourselves as a boy or a girl. Because again, does a 1-year-old view themselves as a boy or a girl? If not, at what age do we start to begin to view ourselves as a boy or girl? What are some of the causes of that? And what are some of the consequences of that? Well, one of the consequences of viewing ourselves as a boy or a girl is the adoption or the development of gender roles. So gender roles are expectations of how boys and girls should think, act, and feel based on their gender. These expectations are typically developed through or influenced by the people that we see on TV, what our parents tell us we should do or how we should act and behave. We hear from our parents, this is how boys should act and this is how girls should act. We see on TV patterns of how girls are acting and how boys are acting, how men are acting, and how women are acting. When we see our fathers hanging out with all of their male friends, we observe how they're acting and we realize that that's behavior that, or we begin to believe that that is behavior that is specific to boys. And when we see our mother hanging out with her friends, we begin to see that, you know, that's normal, or that's normal behavior or typical behavior for how girls should think, act, and feel. We adopt our gender roles as our own through gender typing, and that's basically just adopting our own gender and saying this is we're a boy or we're a girl, and therefore we should act this way. This graph here basically outlines the difference between gender, sexual orientation, and sex. And so our sex is whether or not we are male or female. Sexual orientation is basically our desire to have intimate relationships with males or females, or I should say people of the same sex or people of the opposite sex. Now, we don't really get into sexual orientation in early childhood. Now, Freud might, but we don't. We don't really get into it in this class. We typically reserve that discussion for adolescence because that is when it becomes much more prominent in our development. But gender is the main idea here is that gender is different from sex and that gender is a cognitive construct, or it's something that exists that is influenced by society. It's not based, it doesn't really have a direct absolute similarity to our physical development or essentially our sex, if you will. It is related to it, but it is not the exact same thing. So gender is, yes, influenced by biological processes. We cannot deny that boys and girls have different types of anatomy. They have different types of hormones. They have different types of biology. And so the way that our gender manifests itself in terms of the behaviors that we engage in and the way that we think and the way that we feel, all of those things are going to be influenced by our biology. But is it purely biological? Or do we also become influenced by cultural definitions of masculinity and femininity? So for example, the behavior on the left here, we see a male who's lifting weights. He's basically a bodybuilder. He's lifting heavy weights for sports. Do females engage in this behavior? Yes. Do females engage in this behavior as often as men? I think it's safe to say that not. Do females who engage in this behavior do they have other behaviors that are also similar to men? Do women who engage in this behavior, are they more likely to wear a dress? Or are they less likely to wear a dress than other women who do not engage in this behavior? That doesn't mean that they're not a woman. What we're talking about is their gender. We're talking about the types of behaviors that they engage in, and are they more in line with the norms of one sex or the other sex? That is gender. So, look at the next image. We see some males and females, some men and women who are healthcare practitioners. So I teach this class, Lifespan Growth and Development. It is a prerequisite for the nursing program at Brazosport College, as well as many other nursing programs. This class is predominantly made up of women. I've been teaching this class for 5 or 6 years. This class is predominantly made up of women. Why is that? Why is this class different from all the other classes that I've taught, like Learning Framework and General Psychology, and that it is 80 to 90% female? I've had it where there's only one male in a class of 24 humans, just 23 females and one male. Why is that? Like I said, it is a prerequisite for the nursing program. I think it's a fascinating class for just learning about how humans change and how humans develop. But if we're going to believe that there is a strong connection between the people who take this class and the people trying to get into the nursing program, well then let's look at the nursing program. What does it look like, the people that want to get into the nursing program? Is it a predominantly male field? No, it's not. It's a predominantly female field. It's a predominantly female profession. Why is that? Well, just like 50 years ago when it was essentially immoral and illegal and just not common to see interracial relationships, there were no doctors on television. There were no female doctors on television. There was a point where there were no female doctors because females were not allowed to become doctors. It was essentially immoral because there was a time where it was understood that the place for a woman was not in the workplace but was at home. And so we grow up as little girls and we see our mom who's at home and cooking and cleaning. Well, we should say that our mom saw our grandma cooking and cleaning because many of our moms did not have the opportunity to be raised by a woman who was a doctor. Those opportunities just didn't exist. And so our moms grew up essentially identifying with our grandmothers, right? I mean, we tend to do that. That's identification with the same-sex parent. That's part of psychoanalytic theory. Little boys don't want to be like their dads, and little girls don't want to be like their moms. It's identification with the same-sex parent. And we imitate those behaviors. We observe them and imitate them. So what happens when we do not have role models in our environment that match the way that we look? And so what that goes to emphasize is the importance of having role models that look like us in terms of our gender and our race. Having role models that look like us in terms of our gender and our race is going to increase the likelihood that we act and behave like those people. We do not tend to act and behave like people who do not look like us at all. People who don't look like us, people who don't talk like us, people who don't act like us. It is more difficult for us to be accepting and open to imitating those behaviors. And then all of this, while we're having these biological influences, while we're having these social influences, we're also thinking about this stuff. We're also cognitively forming these schemes or schemas. And we begin to understand that sports like football, that's reserved for boys. we begin to understand that cheerleading, that's a sport that's reserved for girls. But why? I think the answer is because it's just always been that way. Or I don't know, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe biology does have something to do with it. Maybe the physicality of football is more in line with male development. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm sure that's an argument that some people would be willing to make. There was a time where women were not allowed to engage in combat for the military. It didn't matter how patriotic a woman was. They didn't believe that her place was on the battlefield. Of course, our society has changed, right? So the question I present to you now, because obviously we're kind of in the thick of it with regard to gender and society now, obviously what was considered normal or what was not accepted 50 years ago, think about how that's changed. And think about how different it was 50 years before that. Now try to imagine what it's going to look like in 50 years. What are gender roles going to look like in 50 years? You may not be happy with it. You may be happy with it. But here's the thing we understand about society and how it changes. You know, some people get left behind. Some people refuse to change with society. And that goes back to their understanding of morality. They don't understand that things change. All right. Let's try to move on from that. Talk about parenting styles. Let's talk about authoritarian parenting versus authoritative parenting. So, and I think that this also does relate to, certainly moral development, maybe gender in some way, shape, or form, but certainly we're talking about rules and expectations, right? So I think that has a lot to do with morality. And well, actually going back to expectations, I think that has a whole lot to do with development of gender as well. Well, let's talk about these. So, there are 4 different parenting styles that we're going to discuss. The first 2 are authoritarian and authoritative. Very common for students to get these confused because they sound very similar to one another. Authoritarian parenting is a much more strict parenting style. There are lots of rules and expectations that are set, but these rules and expectations have an emphasis on obedience and respect. So for example, why is this rule in place and why are these expectations in place? Under the authoritarian parenting style, it is because I said so and because I am the boss and I am the parent and you are the child. That is the authoritarian approach to parenting. I am the boss, I am the parent, you are the child, because I said so, and it's going to be done my way, and that's it. Now, it's important to understand that there are some parents who use this style exclusively. That means that this is their approach to parenting 100% of the time. And so this is where I want you to understand that parenting can be a blend. Some people can be very strict authoritarians, or some people can be a hybrid between authoritarian and authoritative, and some people can be strictly authoritative. So authoritarian parenting does not encourage communication and dialogue. They are very quick to identify a child who is quote unquote talking back. These people often believe that children should only speak when they are spoken to. Children should be seen but not heard. They allow for very little verbal exchange. They do not believe that the opinion of a child matters because they're a child. And they do not have any interest in allowing the child to communicate how they think and feel. What could possibly go wrong with this? Well, it's important to understand that the research involving parenting styles is correlational. We have some people who are raised under this parenting style who go off to become very successful and very socially adequate and adept people. But we do see that children raised under this parenting style exclusively are more likely to develop symptoms like shyness, aggression, shyness specifically in females, aggression more so in males, and also poor communication skills. How are children supposed to feel comfortable communicating their thoughts and feelings to their teachers, to a police officer, to their peers, when they are constantly being told to only speak when they're spoken to? How should we expect a child to go up to a teacher and tell them that they're being bullied at home when they are, or when they're being bullied by someone on the playground, when they're constantly being told to shut up and they're constantly being told that they aren't expected to be heard? Now, authoritative parenting style is similar to authoritarian parenting style in one way, that there are rules and expectations. The difference is that these rules and expectations are set with an emphasis on decision making. And so what that means is that we try to explain why the rules exist. And we try to get children to communicate what it was that they were thinking when they made a decision to either break a rule or even follow a rule, and try to explain the importance of rules, the importance of expectations, and it's not just because I said so. These parents want to hear from their children, and they want these children to communicate to them what they were thinking when they broke the rule. They want their children to communicate to them why they think a rule is in place to begin with. And of course, just because a person is raised with authoritative parents, that doesn't mean that they are absolutely going to be successful, because it's not causal research, it's correlational. But we do see that these children are more likely to become mature at an earlier age, socioemotionally speaking. They're more likely to be friendly. They're more likely to have good communication skills. We refer to this as pro-social skills. So what do we see is that authoritarian parents are more likely to develop antisocial behaviors in their children, and where children who are raised under authoritative parents, they're more likely to develop pro-social skills. More likely to. Neglectful parenting. These are parents that are essentially not around. They have no rules or expectations. Typically because they're, like I said, they're not around. They're always working, or they're always traveling, or they may be engaging in substance abuse. So they have no rules, they have no expectations, and furthermore, they very rarely are there to provide any sort of reinforcement for good behaviors either. So these children often display issues like lack of self-control. They often show physical and cognitive developmental issues. What does this mean? With physical developmental issues, we looked at being overweight. So going back to nutrition, if these children are not being told that what foods are good to eat and what foods are bad to eat, then there's a very good chance they could become overweight, because they don't understand proper nutrition. They don't understand self-control in what they eat. On the other hand, if the parent isn't even providing basic needs like food, then they can be underweight. And then we also have social incompetence as well too. So social incompetence is basically not being able to understand the emotions of other people, not being able to understand their own emotions. So it goes back to emotional awareness, and being able to essentially establish theory of mind, being able to understand the thoughts, the feelings, and the experiences of other people. These children are very, very egocentric, much like the same way that children who are raised under indulgent or permissive parenting style. These children also experience very few rules or expectations, but these parents are very highly involved, which means that they spoil their children. That's a very, very common expression of indulgent or permissive parenting. Children get to make all the decisions. So authoritative parenting does encourage decision making, but they encourage it as a collective agreement. So for example, if an authoritative parent, one of their goals is likely, or expectation, that children eat their vegetables, an authoritative parent might ask their children what kind of vegetable they would like to have with their dinner. Whereas a child who's raised under a permissive parent, they may never even be presented with those options, and they may just have the ability to choose whatever it is that they want to eat. These children are also associated with having lack of self-control, being immature, and also having peer-related issues. These are children that basically lack discipline. So it's important to understand that neglectful parents and indulgent or permissive parents do not impose discipline. They do not discipline their children. Now, going back to authoritarian and authoritative parenting. These parents do implement rules, and they do have expectations, and they do have discipline. They may have some sort of punishment schedule or punishment system in place. Now, one of the things that, if we haven't looked at yet, we will look at eventually, is that punishment does not always have to be physical. Now, if an authoritative parent spanks their child, that does not mean that they are an authoritarian parent. As long as they explain why the punishment is being put in place, and they explain the why the rules were broken, they also offer some sort of communication as to why the child should not engage in that behavior again, other than for just fear of lack of punishment, that is an authoritative parent, because you understand that they are imposing punishment, they are basically implementing rules and expectations, but they are communicating along the way. They are communicating the importance of the rules, why the rules exist, and also they're giving them options as to what they could do in the future. So I think that's really important too, trying to teach your children new behavior, because remember that if we punish a behavior on its own, that in itself does not teach them a new behavior. It just suppresses that behavior that they were punished for. Authoritarian parents, they're going to have rules and expectations and implement punishment, and typically they're not going to explain why the rules are in place other than because I said so, and typically the only explanation they're going to get during the punishment is that if they do it again, they're going to get punished again, and that's all there is to it. It's very black and white. So here's some questions to consider, because typically, like I said, it's very rare that a parent is absolutely one parenting style all the time. Sometimes they can be a blend of the two. So I like to think of it as authoritarian parents being extremely, extremely strict and rigid and no flexibility, whereas permissive parents basically have no rules and no expectations and just let their kids do whatever they want. And then authoritative parenting is somewhere in the middle. And so just understand that it's a spectrum. So we can have extremely authoritarian parenting, we can have extremely permissive parenting, or we can have somewhere parents that are a little bit more balanced. And furthermore, if we're raised by two people and we have two parents in our life, or we might even have a third parental figure like an older brother, an older sister, or a grandparent who has a big role in raising us, understand that we are raised by lots and lots of parents. We have lots of parental figures in our life. Some of us do. Some of us have no parental figures, and some of us have lots of them. And so think about this. If authoritative parenting is a balance between having rules and tending to the child's wants and needs, does having one authoritarian parent and one permissive parent provide the balance associated with authoritative parenting? Essentially what I'm saying is, by having a parent who is extremely strict and has lots of rules, and then having another parent who lets you do whatever you want, is that balance? I don't know. Is that? Or should both of those parents basically try to change their parenting style so that way both of them can be more authoritative in their approach and less permissive and less authoritarian? Second question to consider: how do gender, culture, and birth order relate to the implementation of various parenting styles? So think about this. Do boys tend to get parented differently than girls? If so, how? Do boys tend to receive more permissive parenting, whereas girls receive more authoritarian parenting, or they tend to? Maybe just think about your experience. As a male or female with brothers or sisters, do you believe that your brothers and sisters got treated differently? They were raised with a different parenting style than you were because of the fact that they were of a different gender? Does this vary by culture? Do we believe that there are some ethnic groups that have stronger discrepancies in the way that they raise females versus males? I often hear that Hispanic culture, females are raised with a much more strict parenting style than males. Males are given much more privileges and much more opportunities than females. I'm not saying that's true or not. That's just what I've heard. Does the youngest or eldest tend to get treated differently? If so, how? So we haven't really addressed this birth order. We've been talking mostly about gender and age as well, but now with regard to birth order, does the baby of the family get treated differently? Does the oldest, did they get treated differently? Or is a parent harsher on an older child than they are on a younger child? Or does the younger child get raised more permissively, or tend to be? What happened in your experience, I should say, or I should ask. So let's talk about punishment a little bit more. So why should you use physical punishment? Why should you do it? What is the argument for using physical punishment? There is only one argument for using physical punishment, and it makes sense. When you physically punish a child for an undesirable behavior, it teaches them the consequence of that behavior, and in theory, they are less likely to engage in that behavior in the future, because by the powers of operant conditioning, they are going to form an association between a behavior and physical punishment, which they do not like, and so therefore they are less likely to engage in that behavior. And it's just that simple, right? We don't really need to think about it any further than that, do we? Or maybe it is more complicated than that. Let's talk about some of the arguments against using physical punishment. There is an argument that children may imitate the aggressive behavior. Not absolutely will, but they may. It's just an argument. And just like you can make the argument that, just because someone gets hit for doing something, that doesn't mean they're going to stop doing it. Well, just because a child sees someone engage in aggressive behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will do it again, or they will replicate that behavior, imitate that behavior. But according to the Bobo doll study, which we saw that was conducted by Albert Bandura, he kind of proved that we tend to imitate aggressive behavior. That is something that has been scientifically established. Children are more likely to imitate aggressive behavior that they have observed rather than aggressive behavior that they have not observed. A lot of our behavior is learned from witnessing, from watching. The research is very clear. Children that are raised in abusive environments at the home, children that are exposed to domestic violence, dads that beat up on their moms, they are more likely to also repeat the behavior as they get older. It doesn't mean that they absolutely will, but the research is clear. Correlationally speaking, children that are raised in households where there is lots of domestic violence, they are more likely to be members of a domestic violence household as they get older. Another argument against using physical punishment is it can instill fear and avoidance. So if you buy into operant conditioning, you should also buy into classical conditioning, because the law of operant conditioning says that yes, if we punish a behavior, it is less likely to occur. But by the law of classical conditioning, we are also going to form an association between the punishment and the person instilling that punishment. And so therefore, children that are hit repeatedly by a person for engaging in bad behavior, not only are they going to form an association between the pain and the behavior, but they are likely and possibly going to form an association between the pain and the person. And so they are likely to basically develop a fear and avoidance to that person. And there are some parents out there who equate that to respect. Say, as long as I want my child to fear me, and if a child avoids me, it doesn't really affect me because I just want them to behave the way that I believe is the appropriate way to behave. And I can see the importance that they're putting on appropriate behavior rather than having a warm and loving relationship with them. That's basically secondary to them behaving appropriately. But what happens when children get older and they have trouble basically approaching their parents and talking to them about the emotional challenges that they're experiencing, let's say in adolescence? I've already talked about this. It does not teach new behavior. We need to give children an option. We need to say, hey, you're going to be punished for this next time. Why don't you think about this first? Why don't you do this instead? Can escalate to abuse. So abuse is a term, child abuse is a term that is basically, I should say it's a standard of measure that has changed throughout, the past several decades. We see a picture here of a boy. He has lots of marks on his legs. He was hit with a switch, they call it, a wooden stick. Excuse me. So this child was hit with a wooden stick repeatedly across his leg and he left a mark. 30 years ago, this probably would not constitute child abuse. You send this kid to school, the teacher sees these marks on his legs, probably not a big deal. Some of your parents probably got it this bad. And again, rules change, laws change, morality changed. This was not considered immoral behavior 30 years ago. Now, it is very commonly seen as immoral behavior, and it's commonly seen as abuse. This is what we see right here. No one is saying that you cannot hit your kid. No one said that. And if that is what you are hearing, then you are not thinking critically. No one said that you cannot physically punish your child. What we are telling you is that if you leave a mark on your child and you send your child to school with these kinds of marks, it will likely lead to an investigation because the teacher is required to report this kind of instance, whether or not the teacher agrees with it or not. And so take that in mind too. Let's say you want to become a professional like a nurse or a teacher and you think it's acceptable for a child to be hit this way. Well, I'm telling you right now that if you do not report this, you will likely lose your job. You will likely lose your license. And furthermore, if you send your child to school like this and they report it and the teacher reports it, you are likely going to lose your job. you are likely going to lose your license that you have been given to by the state for being a nurse or being a teacher, because this constitutes child abuse. You do not have to agree with it, because quite frankly, you do not make the laws. And I mean, that's just the way that it is. And so the laws have changed. This is child abuse. And so you just have to learn to accept it. And you also have to be prepared to report it if you see it. Let's talk about parenting, socioeconomic status, and divorce. There are trends that we see regarding parental income or household income, that's socioeconomic status, as well as parenting styles. What we see is that parents of higher socioeconomic status, they tend to be more authoritative. They tend to be. There are lots of parents with lots of money who are bad parents. There are lots of parents with no money who are great parents. What we see, though, is a tendency for parents of higher socioeconomic status. Not only do they tend to be more well educated, not only do they tend to have more prestigious careers, they also just tend to be more authoritative in the way that they communicate with their children. Parents of a lower socioeconomic status background, parents from poverty, they tend to be more authoritarian. They tend to have very strict, rigid rules. They are more likely to have this kind of approach in raising their children, and they are more likely to use physical punishment. Do not lose sight of the fact that we are speaking in terms of correlations. There are many parents out there that come from a lower socioeconomic status who use purely authoritative parenting style and use absolutely no physical punishment. And I think this is where it's important to understand that you can punish a child in different ways other than being physical with them. You can take away their toys. You can put them to bed earlier. You can change their bedtime. You can give them bedtime as extra. You can give them extra time staying awake as a reward, and you can basically send them to bed as a punishment. You can take away their toys. You can take away their allowance. You can take away their TV. Physical punishment is not the only solution. And so now that I say that, I want you to think about the difference between higher socioeconomic status and lower socioeconomic status parents. Lower socioeconomic status parents may not have the toys and the TVs and the video games to provide their children to essentially take them away when the children are misbehaving. Quite frankly, hitting someone doesn't cost any money. So hitting people is free essentially from a monetary standpoint, and so I think that's probably my theory as to why lower socioeconomic status or lower socioeconomic status parents are more likely to use physical punishment. Of course, divorce is an issue that we're going to be talking about throughout this course. Children of divorce tend to struggle with social stressors, which means that they struggle with coping with social anxiety. They struggle with coping with bullying because they have one less parent to communicate with. They have one less parent that they can approach and talk to about what they're feeling and what they're experiencing in terms of the stress of everyday social life when they go to school and such. So imagine that. Understand that we all have different parenting experiences. Some of us are raised by two great parents. Some of us are raised by two bad parents. Some of us are raised by two average parents. Some of us are raised by one great parent and one bad parent. Some of us are only raised by one parent. And then you ask yourself, well, if you only have one parent, that basically cuts the chances of you having a good parent in half. Because if you have two parents, you have two chances of having a good parent. If you have one parent, you only have one chance at having a good parent. And if you go home and there's only one parent there, and that parent is busy because they're working or they're maintaining the house, and then maybe they don't even have a good parenting style to begin with, these children of divorce are just going to be less likely to have that kind of social support. Regarding sibling relationships in birth order, when we discuss the relationships that people have with their siblings, it's based on a wide range of factors. One, emotional quality. How does my brother and sister make me feel? Does my brother make me feel scared? Does my sister make me feel happy? Does my sister make me feel loved? Familiarity and intimacy. How well do I identify with my brother or my sister? Are me and my brother and sister the same? Do we have the same interests? Or do we have nothing in common at all? Maybe they're so much older than me and younger than me that I can't talk to them about the things that I'm experiencing because they just wouldn't understand. How is a 15-year-old brother supposed to talk to a 7-year-old sister about, the things he's experiencing in terms of bullying or peer pressure? The 7-year-old sister is just not likely going to understand those concepts. And then, of course, all relationships have some element of conflict, and some are just more conflictive than others. Some of us have a lot of conflict with our siblings, and some of us don't. And then birth order. What we see is that firstborns, they tend to be more organized and achieving. Tendency means correlational research. So firstborns, they just tend to be organized and achieving. Why is that? I don't know. I mean, really, we can just present a bunch of theories that try to understand that. Is it because parents only have this one child that they need to focus on? I would imagine having only one child is a lot easier to manage than having 6 children. Like, I imagine if you have 6 children, these children are much more likely to get away with stuff, and it's going to be much more difficult to implement a behavioral plan on 6 children than it is on 1. Laterborns tend to be more rebellious and liberal. I'm not sure why that is. Laterborns tend to be more rebellious and liberal. What the research shows is that laterborns, the younger children, they tend to be, parents tend to take a more permissive approach with them. And so these children, the babies, they tend to have less rules and less structure, which basically can lead to these kinds of developments. Only children, so when I was thinking about firstborn, I was saying they tend to be more organized and achieving. I was actually thinking about only children in that situation, but firstborns are like only children in that they are only children for a set amount of time. They're an only child until the second one comes around. When the second one never has a chance of being an only child. The firstborn is an only child for a certain amount of time. But anyways, not only do firstborns have the experience of being an only child for a certain amount of time, but they're often given a lot more responsibilities as well too. They're often asked to assist in the caring of their younger siblings. And so that kind of responsibility, I think, assists in that development of being more organized and achieving. Only children tend to be more achieving and agreeable, and I think that I've outlined those arguments earlier about how, or that theory that maybe it's because parents only have that one child that they need to manage as opposed to 6. Important things to understand about this, though, is the differences are minimal. And so when we talk about correlational research, some relationships are stronger than others. And so with this relationship, it's important to point out that it's not a super strong pattern. Lastly, we'll talk about television and video games. Television and video games have huge implications in our society. They have a huge role in our society. But when we talk about television and video games, although they're likely to have an influence on our moral development, our language development, our understanding of gender roles, all of these things can also be essentially measured by the time that we spend, or the influence of the TV can be influenced by the amount of time that we spend watching TV as well as what it is that we're watching or the content. What we see is that most children spend about 2 to 4 hours per day on a screen. So that might be a phone, a tablet, or a TV, or a computer screen, because TV has just become so revolutionized just within the past 5 to 10 years. We can watch TV on our computer. We can watch TV on our computer screen, on our phone. What psychologists recommend is just 1 hour. 1 hour on a screen a day. Now, of course, this was written before a pandemic hit, and so, with the pandemic and all the revolutions of technology, we're spending more and more and more screen time. But what we see is that, children do need an opportunity to be outside and be active, and that's a difficult thing to do when we're looking at a screen. TV is not always bad. TV can be pro-social. It can promote cognitive development. TV shows can promote sharing and caring. TV shows can, promote acceptance. TV shows can explain the importance of diversity. TV shows can explain cognitive concepts like new words and teach children new concepts. I don't have to explain that to you. You know that exists. The question is, are your kids watching that, or are they watching Game of Thrones? What benefit does a 5-year-old get from watching Game of Thrones, being exposed to sex and violence? And so, I mean, that's the society that we live in. And one might say that show doesn't do any harm, but does it do any good? So I think you have to understand both sides of it. Whatever it is that we are doing for children, it may not be good, but it might be bad. It may not be bad, but that doesn't mean that it's good. I mean, what I'm just saying is that it's complicated, because these things that we see on TV, they're going to influence all aspects of our development, our language, our sense of morality, our sense of gender, our sense of equality, all these things. And it's also going to influence our physical development too. You know, we can learn about healthy eating from watching TV. At the same time, typically when we're watching TV, we're typically not eating healthy. So that concludes socio-emotional development in early childhood.